All right, so we're gonna start, right? The format for this next session is more or less identical with the format of the previous one. Our topic is We the People, Race and Immigration as a Challenge to Modern Democracies. You have on your program the names of the four commenters who will lead us off, each for about 5 minutes, after which there'll be an opportunity for a little conversation among those speakers and then with other members of the panel until we turn to the audience for audience question. May I ask Roger Smith to start us off? Thank you, Rogers.
Thank you, and my thanks to the organizers. Our topic needs no defense. Clearly, race and immigration are posing challenges to many modern democracies. Leaders and movements professing to be populist have built support through anti-immigrant themes and policies, sometimes allied with espousal of the superiority of persons of European or white descent, as well as Christianity. When they gain power, these leaders and movements are often dangerously authoritarian in ways that threaten democracy. But why do modern democracies have trouble dealing with race and immigration? I will note first the two deepest historical sources of these difficulties. Second, some recent aggravating circumstances. And finally, I'll suggest what democracies should do to cope better with these challenges. The first of the two historical sources is the long line of thought going back to Aristotle, arguing that systems of popular self-governance, republics or democracies, especially require their populations to have senses of shared identity, a high degree of perceived homogeneity. The claim is that democracies need senses of shared identity to have broad, stable senses of trust among fellow citizens and between citizens and leaders. However, all human beings both share many traits with all other human beings and differ on many traits from all other human beings. It is not obvious what forms of homogeneity are needed to sustain broad senses of civic trust. In fact, many different features play these roles in different societies. But there are dominant tendencies to stress having religions in common and ancestors in common. The most powerful ways to make people feel they are members of a cherished people are the beliefs, first, that God has made them a people, and second, that they are an extended family due to shared ancestors. Understandably, then, leaders and members of democracy often contend that they should share the same religion and same ancestry and favor policies to make sure that they do. These desires for ancestral and religious homogeneity do not, however, fully explain why racial as well as religious differences are so troublesome. The second historic reason is how racial and religious doctrines were used to justify European imperial conquests, and then the rule and economic exploitation by European-descended settlers of other populations in the United States and elsewhere. That history has given European-descended groups in many lands, especially white Christian groups, senses of vested interest in and psychological attachments to their own predominance. Those interests and attachments mean that many can be persuaded that movements toward greater racial and religious equality and diversity are deeply threatening to them. Still, why all this now? Many recent developments have converged to make the challenges of race and immigration for democracies acute today. These include heightened immigrant flows into the more prosperous modern democracies punctuated by refugee crises, heightened economic inequalities in many nations exacerbated by the Great Recession, the decline in most modern societies of many traditional forms of religion in favor of newer types of spirituality and more secular public spheres, and the impacts of liberation movements seeking more equal status for many long discriminated against groups, including racial, ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities, indigenous peoples, women, LGBTQ persons, culturally distinct regions, the disabled, and more. At times, more equal statuses are pursued via controversial grants of distinctive rights and privileges. These recent developments have converged to make many with more traditional racial and religious senses of themselves feel their statuses are precarious now because, in fact, their privileged statuses are eroding. They often listen to those who promise to defend their privileges. I believe strongly that immigration is, on balance, a key element of national economic growth and international economic growth and a source of cultural enrichment. I also believe, however, that the members of modern democracies who feel threatened by these developments are people whose concerns deserve to be taken seriously, precisely because those concerns reflect desires to protect privileges and longings for racial and religious homogeneity. It's easy to dismiss them as purely bigoted. We are seeing in many countries, however, that such dismissive treatment is a formula for democracies to fail miserably to meet the challenges of race and immigration. What should we do instead? We must recognize that while the benefits of immigration are national, the short-term costs of new immigrants in terms of public services, cultural adjustments, and sometimes economic displacements are often locally concentrated. If the U.S. government, for example, provided more aid to the local and state public institutions, the schools, hospitals, social services, and civic agencies of immigrant-receiving communities to help immigrants flourish, then immigrants would adapt more rapidly, contribute more visibly, and frictions would diminish sooner. Yet just as we should seek to aid communities with new immigrants, we must also show concern to aid those older stock Americans who feel their economic prospects are diminishing or that their religious and cultural institutions and practices are being burdened by public policies. We should invest in their region's infrastructures to promote jobs and economic development. And whenever we can let them keep their tax breaks, their distinctive schools, businesses, and customs consistently with the well-being of others, we should do so. The answers to helping modern democracies deal with the challenges of race and immigration turn on building bridges, not walls. We need policies that provide bridges so that all groups have more opportunities to move forward and to traffic productively with all others in their societies. And if, in America, we can find ways to build bridges, not walls, I predict that the benefits of Mexican immigration and all other immigration will pay for them.
Oh, Bill Galston, please.
Yes, well, the topic of this panel is large and complicated, and in the interests of having a tractable 5-minute opening statement, I've decided to focus on the immigration side of the race and immigration challenge. And I want to parse the challenge in 3 different kinds of questions, to which I'll give my own answers. Question 1, does immigration represent a practical or policy challenge to liberal democracies? And the answer to that question is clearly yes. It is, on my reading, a principal driver, if not the principal driver, of the recent populist upsurge in the United States, the UK, throughout Europe, and in several European countries already. It is leading in dangerously illiberal, and I believe eventually, inevitably, non-democratic directions. As Rogers mentioned already, immigration can constitute a stressor on developed welfare states, especially in hard economic times, which often induce policies of austerity, which intensifies the balance for the competition for social services. And that is particularly true in the, as Rogers also pointed out, in communities that receive a large share, because immigration confers diffuse benefits over time for a society as a whole, but concentrated costs immediately for particular parts. And I have to say, I find very plausible the idea of what used to be called impact aid in order to reflect that fact. But we're not just talking about economics. There's a line of sociological research that I think is pretty solid to the effect that, at least at the beginning, increased diversification of populations tends to lead to heightened mistrust within those populations. Cultural and linguistic differences can spark fear, antipathy, or even violence, and as we have seen, aroused majorities can be tempted to invade or erode the rights of minorities. And all of these problems are exacerbated when public authorization for a relatively generous economic immigration policy appears to be lacking. And I could spend a lot of time on case studies such as the UK under Blair, Angela Merkel's 2015 decision, et cetera, to talk about the consequences of lack of democratic authorization. Question number 2, which I can deal with more briefly: does immigration pose a theoretical challenge to liberal democracy? And here my answer, which may surprise you, is negative. I don't think it does, for 2 reasons. First of all, from the very beginnings of democracy with the Greeks, the right of the demos to determine the composition of the demos has been affirmed. And that is the beginning of a discussion, not the end of it. But the idea that the demos is delimited and in some respects self-delimiting, I think is built into the deep structure of democratic theory. Another point along the same lines that I would make is that even in the context of universal principles of individual rights, there are always to be found key elements of collective particularity. We can all recite the famous second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. We tend to overlook the first paragraph that begins, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. Where did this idea of the people come from? It is a kind of a primitive assumption. It is a point of departure for this discussion. Question number 3, my final question. Is immigration a moral challenge to liberal democracies? This is a harder question, but I think in many respects it is. We can dismiss, or perhaps it would be more forthcoming to say, I dismiss 2 extreme views. The first is Peter Singerish global utilitarianism, where everybody counts for one regardless of location, and you just do a global calculation. The other extreme that I reject is the idea that for members of a particular political community, non-members can be assigned a moral weight of 0. That, I think, is also a deep moral mistake. The most plausible view, I believe, is what I will call limited self-preference. There is, one way of parsing this is as a vision of concentric circles of obligation and responsibility, which are most intense at the core and become more diffuse at the periphery, but they never disappear. And in order to plumb the limits of limited self-defense, it would be necessary to work through a series of individual cases, which, if I had time, I would. But as I don't, I won't. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. It's an honor to join you. In the summer of 2017, I interviewed a number of thinkers in France whose ideas on identity and unidirectional immigration have themselves migrated to the United States and influenced alt-right activists and racists here, both indirectly and directly. Politically, these European thinkers are all over the spectrum, but what unites them is the theme of replacement, the idea that identity is a zero-sum game and that migration and mixing constitute an existential threat to Western majority white societies. Their alarmist message is one that has resonated widely. Whether or not history really is dialectical, it does seem plausible to think that decades of liberal gains in Europe and America have helped give rise to the antithesis of liberalism. In Paris, where I live, left-wing intellectuals and their well-meaning followers often seem reluctant to acknowledge that the recent arrival of millions of refugees in Europe, many of them impoverished, poses any complications at all. In America, on the other hand, many liberals treat discussions of identity as though the country were an English department, as if a familiarity with critical race and gender studies, post-colonial history and queer theory are the threshold for participating in and making sense of one's own society. This tendency is exacerbated by a further and often well-meaning urge to treat white identity and what we now commonly call privilege as a kind of original sin to be overcome. Such discourses, unfortunately, have created openings for genuinely racist and anti-liberal thinkers to exploit. One of the great intellectual projects of the coming years and decades will be to make honest sense of our increasingly complicated national realities, to set a correct and compelling vision of a multi-ethnic America, a multi-ethnic set of democracies around the world. It will be a vision that will have to acknowledge the inherited importance of race and other identity categories while attempting to attenuate rather than reinforce the extent to which these abstractions define us. One of the more frightening lessons of calamitous events like Brexit or the Trump victory has to do with the implacability of tribalism. Edifying sermons about a shared American or French or British or German identity struggle to pierce as deep as the primal and particular identities that still animate so many people and groups. This includes class identity. Even the struggle against economic inequality eventually must take notice of psychology and culture. The commonality that we all seek may be forever, at least partially, aspirational. And so we need a liberalism or transcendent humanism that neither dismisses nor fetishizes identity grievances, but looks instead for ways to build on who we are more broadly and to conceive more boldly what we might be able to accomplish in concert. Yet as the tenuousness of even our most noble and seemingly durable civil rights gains grows more apparent by the news cycle, we must also consider that a full social healing may not be possible. The rancor in our politics may be as permanent as it is unpleasant. There will always be alienated citizens and communities. There will always be groups that value themselves most of all. There will always be political winners and losers. And so we are going to need a liberalism that, while pushing our societies to equal their ideals, soberly recognizes the harsh and at times irreducible realities of who we are. That would be a liberalism that is unafraid to acknowledge that there really is a basket of deplorables, for example, out there. However disgusted and mocking it sounds, it is one of the most honest things Hillary Clinton ever said. And that high-minded notions of the common good may never be able to reach this segment of our demos. What we can do in the meantime is try to make their number as small and insignificant as possible and find better and more effective ways to proceed together without them. And this will also require speaking honestly enough about the real changes happening in our societies to defang the illiberal hysteria. Thank you.
So this will be a riff on some of the things Bill raised, but offering some arguments from within liberal democratic theory to answer the democratic theory point that he made. Democracies are understood to have been created by and for a demos, a citizenry. We founded a state, in quotes, a constitutional order for ourselves, bestowing on most of us the title of citizen. Such orders are defended in normatively appealing terms: popular sovereignty, the equality of citizens, fundamental rights, in which non-members figure not at all. Decisions on immigration, that is the physical admission of non-citizens, and naturalization, the admission of a person to membership in a state, are deemed exercises of sovereignty within the full authority of member citizens. Non-citizens have no claim to a right to enter another state, nor a claim to a right to become a member of that state. In fact, to give them such rights would be to undermine the democratic project, weakening both the idea that citizens rule themselves and the effective bonds that citizenship is presumed to embody and foster. That's one version of democratic theory. We, by which I mean the majority of citizens and probably the significant majority of those here today, view populism as a threat to a well-functioning democracy. Its anti-immigrant, xenophobic roots and rants inconsistent with the principles and values that are said to lie at the foundations of our nation. But I think we need to recognize that shorn of racism and nativism, populist claims can be seen as consonant with the deep structure of democracy. This is the point that Bill was making. Populists seek not some revolutionary new form of government, rather populists claim to seek a return to original understandings, fulfillment of the democratic lodestar that here the people rule. From this perspective, it is those pressing for immigration and for the rights of immigrants that make the radical, dare I say, anti-democratic claim, and that at its strongest would be a right for all the world to nominate themselves for entry and membership in a bounded polity thought to be governed by or for its citizens. Now, I want to take that set of arguments on and describe three lines of argument that undercut that populist position, not from an open borders position, but from principles, in fact, that can be drawn from liberal democratic theory. First, the legitimacy of constitutional democracies is established self-referentially. By that I mean a state exists and exercises sovereignty over a territory and people because it has called itself into being. There may well be rules for establishing statehood, some set down by a form of a constituent assembly, but there's nothing prior to which appeal can be made to make legitimate those rules. Non-citizens lay bare the constitutional bootstrap. By what right they may be seen as asserting does a state purport to claim a piece of earth and exclude all others from it? Surely the answer, because we say so, is not one that those excluded would be expected to respect. This challenge applies to all national assertions of territorial sovereignty, but it's particularly poignant when applied to liberal democracies, because there the answer comes back, we the people, in an act of self-realizing popular sovereignty, do ordain our state. Now, it's one thing for a monarch to define his or her subjects as inferiors. It's quite another thing for a group of free and equal people to tell other human beings that they are something less. The construction of a demos, it turns out, is nasty work. Second, liberal democratic theory generally assumes that persons should have the right to participate, directly or indirectly, in the making of the rules that rule them. Non-citizens put significant pressure on that presupposition. Those physically within the state, non-citizens, are plainly subject to state power, tax, regulatory, criminal, even draft laws. National mythologies can be invoked. For example, the citizens, and here we're famous quote, pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, to suggest something unique that citizens and only citizens share. But these are hard to sustain in large and diverse liberal democracies. And even those outside the state, and I think this was a point that Aziz made in the first panel, even those outside the state may have claims to participation inside the state to the extent that state policies have significant effects on their lives. And there's a serious political theory literature that makes this kind of claim. Third argument, these are all arguments about why liberal democratic theory may take issue with the populist democratic theory that says they don't have to worry about immigrants. Third, it turns out that democratic states regularly provide constitutional protections and statutory benefits to non-citizens. These could be classified as acts of sovereign grace, but they often seem to be more than this. Such norms seem to reflect a state's self-conception at a deep level. For example, that a liberal democracy embodies human rights norms applicable to all persons, or that a country is a nation of immigrants and should extend rights to so-called citizens in waiting. In the U.S. context, and other democracies as well, most constitutional rights are guaranteed to persons, not citizens. These protections reflect political principles that are fundamental to liberal democracies, namely that arbitrary distinctions cannot justify differential and discriminatory treatment. Now, non-membership, by definition, might be deemed a non-arbitrary distinction. But the crucial question is in relation to what? For most purposes, most courts in most constitutional democracies have concluded that non-membership is not a ground for denying fundamental rights enjoyed by citizens of that state. So are these arguments strong enough to put the populist democratic position on the defensive? Perhaps. But here I want to get to the other point raised in the first section, that we can think about this as a fight between Rawls and Nozick, I guess as Paul Krugman said, but that's not where the debate's happening today, as a number of people then pointed out. So maybe these are theoretical answers to the populist claim, but when I say these may not win the day, why? This is one reason why populists do not principally rely on the conceptual claims. Rather, they ratchet up the rhetoric, making assertions about how immigration threatens national security, think Trump and the Muslim ban and the caravan, the cultural and demographic constitution of the state, it's not our country anymore, Bill was pointing to this, and the economic costs of migration, both in terms of taking jobs from citizens and being a burden on the welfare state. And these are not just happening in America. Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom stated in their 2016 election literature that instead of financing the entire world and people we don't want here, we'll spend the money on ordinary Dutch citizens. Now, I think they're pretty good answers to these claims. I'll do these very quickly to end here. Countries of the global north have constructed rather effective walls, even if not walls. Thus, the caravan was never a threat to U.S. sovereignty. As to demographic challenge, many democratic states need immigrants to counterbalance a declining domestic birth rate well below domestic level. And third, the data is clear that immigrants are a net economic plus to the U.S. And I'll say in a later comment section about some of the other issues raised here on costs. Now, in running through these arguments and counter-arguments, I have, in fact, basically, I think, depicted the current state of the U.S. debate rather than the three-article debate. So let me end here. I wonder if there's a middle way, a constitutional settlement that can mediate the democratic or liberal democratic position with the immigrants are people too position. Bill offered one, this limited self-preference. Be interesting to hear a bit more about what he means by that. But I'd offer another one here. It might be this, that liberal democratic states possess rather unfettered authority to make admissions and membership rules, but that once permitted in, immigrants are entitled to the array of constitutional rights and other benefits offered to citizens, even perhaps political rights. Linda Bosniak, a legal theorist, has said in a slightly different context, she's labeled this position as hard on the outside and soft on the inside. I've thought about it in terms of decentering citizenship, which I can say more about later. An entirely different set of claims, non-democratic but also anti-populist, would see the legitimacy of states not established by the constitution of that state, but rather by its compliance with international human rights norms, which would set serious checks on the demos's authority to set admission and membership rules. That view may either seem quaint or dreamy today, but never say never.
Would any of the four speakers like to jump in here? If so, no?
Well,
yes, Bill?
I think, Alex, this would be a very long discussion, but let me just offer a couple of simple examples. First of all, the idea that it's never right to assign human beings anywhere the moral weight of zero is, at least in principle, a way of making space for some of the claims that you put on the table. Having said that, I do think that there's a tenable distinction between the rights of human beings as human beings and the rights of human beings as citizens. So then the question reduces to who has the authority to draw the line between people who are human beings simply and those who are human beings with the additional attribute of membership or citizenship. And to illustrate the principle of limited self-preference, here are a couple of examples, very humble examples. You're at home, it's late at night, somebody pounds on your door and says, there's a guy chasing me with a gun, and if you don't let me in, I'm going to be shot to death. It seems to me you would have to have a pretty good reason not to let that person into your house. And I think we both can imagine how that argument would run. Okay, vary the example. It's the middle of the night, somebody knocks on your door and says, I've been thinking, the houses in your neighborhood are a lot nicer than the houses in my neighborhood, and the streets look a lot better, and the schools are a lot better. Let me into your house. Okay? Now, I think intuitively, one of those claims has much greater force than the other. And somewhere in the zone of what might be called the common law of limited self-preference, I think we can find policy-relevant positions. I have to say, it's not exactly clear to me where your position leads in practice and who is going to make these determinations and on what basis and where the limits are. I didn't hear you advocate for open borders exactly, but what closes them?
Yeah, no, I didn't take an open borders position. My middle position was that, it's very straightforward, that polities have a right to limit borders, immigration and membership, but once inside the country, you got to treat people equally. I think actually a very strong, a strong moral claim can be made for the open borders position, which is that borders basically are created to maintain a privilege in a world of rampant inequality. And so if we do take, you've got to make a pretty strong argument, it seems to me, to overcome the inequality that exists in the world. And so the argument that, it's one of these, we love arguments, liberals love arguments, that, we should have more immigrants because it's good for the United States, which is true on balance. But, there could be another position that the real moral position is that immigration should not be a win-win. It should be a lose-win. It should be a win for the immigrant and a loss for the states that have maintained their unequal and privileged position by erecting borders in the world. So, but I do want to make one other point, if I could, here, and that goes to the point that both Rogers and Bill made, that the benefits are national, but the costs are local on immigration. There's some evidence of that there are local costs. What's interesting to me is that the anti-immigrant feeling in the United States is not happening in places where those costs might be happening. So at the border areas are pro-immigration. New York City, where more immigrants than anywhere else in California, deeply pro-immigrant places. So that makes me think that the Trumpian anti-immigration is not coming because people are feeling specific costs, but these are a loss of status or a loss of our country or something else. And I think these are really misplaced arguments that both of you made on that point. I'm skeptical of those arguments.
So we have Roger Smith and then James Kloppenberg. Yes?
Responding to that point, you're absolutely right, Alex, that a lot of the anti-immigrant feeling is in areas that don't have immigrants. But it's not universally true, as those of us who live near Hazleton, Pennsylvania know, that there are areas that received immigrants that haven't traditionally, and it's fed in anti-immigrant politics. But what I would say in regard to your point, which I agree with to a considerable degree, is that if we could help immigrants thrive visibly, it would reduce some of the fodder for fueling fears and anxieties in other parts of the country. And no guarantee, but worth doing. And I also think it would produce a range of other economic and cultural benefits. On the question of limited self-preference, I agree with that position. I also think, though, something that Alex alluded to, that the question of obligations to those outside borders are also influenced by not just the material interests involved, but by the principles according to which we live and the actual legacies of our actions in affecting others. That can, if you have a liberal democracy that is supposedly committed to furthering the project of enjoying rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, you may put your own citizens first, but you also may find historically you've had an impact on others that needs to be taken into account. To use Bill's story, if you have someone who comes and knocks on the door and says, I'm here because you took away the land through which I was feeding myself, and you made me work, the only chance I had was to work in a job where you paid me so little that I couldn't afford housing, and now I'm showing up because I need a room. Well, if you actually did all that to that person, I think you have a special obligation to open the door.
James, yeah? You might have to turn.
Sorry. The ancient roots in the 18th and 19th century points of origin of liberalism and democracy. Today we're talking about all the obstacles that have prevented liberalism and democracy to coming to fruition. And what I'd like to try to do is to pose a question that I hope will bring together the very fine presentations this morning with the ones we've just heard. When we think about what Teresa Garducci called Welfare State 1.0. In the U.S., it was always marked by the legacies of what Aziz Rana talked about, the oppression and exclusion of African Americans in particular. Most all of the universal programs excluded African Americans one way or another. And if Ira Katznelson were here, he could give us chapter and verse on exactly why that happened through the legislation of the New Deal. By contrast, the social democracies of Northern Europe really did put into place much more universal systems of social provision. The question I have now that questions of race and immigration refugees have come home to Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, can anyone think of a successful multiracial social democracy? Because that, I agree, is what we need to construct, not just on this side of the Atlantic, but on the other side and in the southern hemisphere as well. I have a son who lives in South Africa, so I have a particular interest in South Africa because I have a granddaughter named Thando Loetsu. And South Africa, according to the World Bank, is the most unequal nation in the world. And that's in part because the middle class is indeed rising, but in part as a result of rapid immigration, there is an underclass of enormous size and zero assets. So the question I have, and there it's Xhosa and Zulu, but the tensions are real, as any of you who've read Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom will realize. How is it possible, taking the traditions of liberalism and democracy and putting them in place with the traditions of oppression and exclusion, to construct a multiracial, multicultural social democracy?
Thank you. Thomas, yes.
Well, that gets to the comment I wanted to make, which is that I think we're talking about immigration much more than we're talking about the racial component. The example that you gave, I think it matters. That example, it depends on what type of person is knocking on your door. We know that Rekia Boyd went to someone's door for help and was shot in the face because she was a black woman. So I think that there are people who could find a helping hand at a door with a legitimate claim, and there are people who cannot, based on how we still conceive of abstract differences among ourselves and the meaning that we take from that. And so I don't think that the immigration question or who's at home here, who's not at home here can ever be settled without thinking seriously about lessening identity in our daily lives and politics.
I have Aziz next. Yes? Yeah.
So I guess I just wanted to say that it's not clear to me that the distinction that Alex made between what's in immigration scholarships called the immigration rules as opposed to the alienage rules, so the rules about the border, that you can have harsh rules at the border, but then provide fairly expansive rights internally, including perhaps political rights, and that distinction, ensures both liberalism and democracy can be made compatible. And, my basic view is that the rules that you establish at the border essentially inevitably permeate the kind of internal political community that you face. And the reason why is that we have to actually think of these societies, as both Alex and Rogers were noting, as really historically situated and grounded. That it's not the way that the conversation almost always proceeds is through a presumption that there are all of these different states. They're more or less situated the same in the world. They enjoy formal equality. The presumption is a kind of methodological nationalism. And then some people want to move from different places to other places. The story about immigration in the U.S. is in large part a story about the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico and Latin America. And that is a product of the fact that half of Mexico was conquered by the U.S., so that the border was changed on people. And also that we had a state that pursued state and corporate allies that pursued a set of inducements to symbiotically create a labor supply that would move across the border. And then you had policies on top of that in 1965 that for the first time in American history imposed harsh quotas on the Western Hemisphere, where all of a sudden, if you want to come from Bhutan or Kenya, where my family's from, you're facing a similar quota regime to wanting to come from Mexico, where there's already an established labor regime that exists that navigates these communities. And what that means is that now to say, well, actually, these are just rules about political self-definition, is to ignore the entire political economy that's generated what amounts to an underclass. And it's an underclass that, in my view, approximates the old Jim Crow in lots of very explicit ways. You have 20 million undocumented immigrants that live under the shadow of violence through either deportation or actual, other physical forms of disappearing, that are denied systematically political rights, denied legal rights, and half of the immigrant population that's in prison are in segregated, in federal prison, are in segregated federal prisons just for immigrants alone, of which 90% are from Latin America. That strikes me as a set of problems that are historically specific, that have nothing to do with a theoretical debate about open borders, where the only way to address the oppressive condition is actually to decriminalize the border, reject the imperative of it, and to provide systematic economic and political rights to those that live within the country, including having a frank conversation about resident voting rather than just citizenship voting.
I have Jessica, Federico, and Jim Miller. Jessica.
Thanks. I'd like to just make an intervention which may seem a little bit left field, but I think it's an important counterpoint to the discussion about immigration and race. And that is, if we are really intend to have a fully engaged conversation across political spectra, I'd like to take us off the terrain of liberalism as the context for our discussion and think a little bit about what liberalism as a philosophy is doing about these discussions beyond hateful speech, right? And so, not talking about the United States, but context in Eastern Europe, where so-called illiberals have fairly established regimes. At the same time as we see a discourse that securitizes immigrant population, there is also an attempt discursively and to a certain extent institutionally to provide a more expansive notion of the kind of human body that can inhabit the demos. That is to say, we're drawing lines around our citizenry in a way that may seem to liberals heartless and exclusionary with respect to people of various national origins, but we are including people who have very different, a wide spectrum of bodily capacities. And that this is viewed by populations in these countries as being not heartless and not indifferent in the way that liberalism is. And so both as a philosophical and as a political problem, it seems to me that this variety of diversity has to be part of our discussion of what we mean by inclusion and community.
Federico, yeah. Yes, please.
Yes, I would like to just mention a brief personal story, which is that in Argentina, where I'm from, my grandfather came there escaping, from anti-Semitism in Europe in the 1930s. And Argentina actually had racist politics such as the one we are having in this country at the moment. And he was not welcome. And basically what he did is he went to Uruguay, he grabbed a boat, and he was undocumented in Argentina for 20 years, and that's why I'm a citizen. The question is, I don't think the metaphor of the house without a history is the right one, and I agree with Professor Rana here, because, if you live in the US, there is a 30 or 40% chance that your house actually is built on land that actually belongs to Mexico, and it's highly probable that if you build this house now, probably you are building the house with the labor of undocumented migrants. Probably eventually they will also do your loan and perhaps even clean your dishes. So the question is, the borders are open, and I don't think this is theoretical. The borders are open. What do we do with actually an underclass of people that are working in this country, actually paying more taxes than us, insofar as they pay taxes and they don't get a return from their taxes? And so what do we do with them? This is not a question about the tiny people that cross the border, but rather the people that already cross the border are here, are part of the land, and they are children, well, if they don't change the law, will be citizens, as I am, a citizen of Argentina, and actually my grandfather was not. He was an undocumented migrant, escaping, the Nazis.
I wanted to go back to, I think I have this right. Several people said, but I think this is Bill, the right of the demos to delimit itself. And if you take that literally, it means demos democracy. There is no demos or democracy without limits. So I think that the moral case for open borders bumps into a core understanding of democracy going back to ancient Greece, which, as I said last night, is profoundly exclusionary. There's a problem here, it seems to me, that insofar as we stay in an American focus, we don't really see the problem. I think it's easier to see in Europe, as Europe has moved towards some kind of integration, a tentative move towards the United States of Europe. And the question is one of scale. At what scale can a sovereign demos still sense itself as a coherent, integrated people with a common identity? And here I am reminded, I want to go back to something Rogers Smith said. Many European nations, particularly Scandinavian nations, never really had to deal with this problem because they were very homogeneous. They all, came from Lutheran backgrounds and, they're a common ancestry. So that I think Rogers is correct that the primordial kind of glue of the demos is religious and ancestral. And when you blow up the scale, and particularly when you bring in people from very different kinds of backgrounds, ancestrally and religiously, the question is, what is the common identity? And the United States, the question was posed, do we have an example of a functioning multicultural, multiracial social democracy? Well, I think the closest we have, with all its flaws, is actually perhaps the United States. But there's a thinness to American identity. Samuel Huntington, in his notorious final book, talks about this when he says, "Who are we?" And he poses the question of, is it enough in a large territorial state to have a commitment to shared abstract ideals? And this conversation, much of it has been pretty abstract at the level of rights. And if that's all you're hanging on to, isn't at some point the primordial demos, which in the United States was white, exclusionary, white supremacist, to be blunt about it, isn't it going to rear up its head and reassert itself? Because it's in the DNA of the exclusionary logic of delimiting a people. That's my question. Rogers?
I have Astra Taylor and then Ben Fountain. Astra.
Somebody's made this point already, but just to remind us that even with the border wall being in the media all the time, that actually Americans, the polls show that people are more warm to immigration than they have been since the 60s. So I think that brings me to a flip side of the question Jim just raised, which is, okay, the demos has to limit itself, but there are also very limited opportunities for the demos to expand itself, right? The demos doesn't have a lot of legal avenues to, there are ways you can bring in your family if they're immigrants, right, through legal channels. But where, as citizens, do we have an opportunity to bring in excluded outsiders, right? I know one of my dearest friends is married to someone who she simply cannot get legal status in this country. So it makes me think of a program in Canada, the private sponsorship program, that since the 1970s has allowed Canadians to come together, groups of 5 random individuals, as long as they promise financial support, emotional support, they can sponsor refugees. So 300,000 people have been brought into Canada through this. And we know that there was demand over the last few years that greatly exceeded the government's capacity to allow citizens to bring new people into the demos. So I just want to say that we don't know what people would want if there were programs or opportunities for them to do that here. I think one man in my movie last night, he says who counts and who gets counted, and I just think we also have to always remember, who's counting, whose interests are served by inflating the number 1 million. There are 1 million refugees coming to Europe, right? If you're in the business of border security and biometric surveillance, then you want to make that number seem really high and really scary. And lastly, I think that it makes sense that from the vantage of North America, as people with citizenship, that we, as progressives, emphasize the right to mobility, right? And I think that's really important. But one thing that I took away making my film and talking to people on the move and talking to migrants was that people, yes, wanted open borders, but what they really wanted was the right to stay put. They didn't want to have to leave in the first place. And I think we have to talk about both those things at once: the right to move, but the right to stay.
So I was very much taken with Roger Smith, his identifying 2 criteria in particular that have been used throughout history for specifying a demos, and those were common religion and common ancestors. I think the United States is a mentally ill country, deeply mentally ill, and I think the illness lies at the heart of the construction of this mythic identity of whiteness as being the primary American identity. And I mean, when you look at it in terms of religion, African Americans, within a very short time, each generation of being brought to the United States, they became ardent Christians often, and were the most vigorous practitioners of the Christian religion. And in terms of ancestors in common, you look at the diaries of Mary Chestnut, who was a Grand Southern belle. Her father was a South Carolina senator, and then her husband was a South Carolina senator in the antebellum South. And she said, well, when you speak to any of the grand ladies in the neighborhood, each one can name the fathers of the mixed-race children running around the yards of their neighbors. But when it comes to the mixed-race children in their own households, they seem to think these children dropped from the clouds. And so I think, this myth of whiteness as the American identity, it is a historical lie. And I think it has produced a kind of schizophrenia in America. And so if you want to inflame that schizophrenia, then have groups of, people of color knocking on our door, asking to be let in, often on compassionate grounds. So I think, we will never become a healthy country, a well country, until we dig deep into our own past and to what really forms the authentic American identity. And it's much more complicated than this mythic whiteness.
I have Roger, then Bill Golston, then Alexander, then Michael. Rogers. You come, sir? All right.
Hi, Jeff. I argued that religion and ancestry have been the most powerful bonds of a sense of common peoplehood, and I think that's right. I don't think it's inevitable that those are the bonds, and I don't think it's desirable that those are the bonds. Many communities are bonded around a linguistic identity. I think it is preferable in many ways to foster a sense of shared identity as part of a shared historical endeavor, relying less on myths of religion and ancestry. But what I want to say is that the problems of democracy and immigration today are highlighting two challenges. One is that we need to find ways of senses of common identity that don't rely on religion and ancestral myths. I think it can be done, but it is a major political challenge. And the second is that I think we do need to foster senses of common identity which are comfortable with multiple overlapping memberships of a sort that assist immigration, of a sort that may well reflect historical relationships that require support for communities that have been mistreated in the past and present. Jim's comments suggested that if we move in the direction of multiple overlapping memberships, we might end up with thin senses of identity that wouldn't work politically, and that is a challenge that needs to be faced. But I would note that we all feel we belong to multiple human groups that are deeply meaningful to us, and it isn't, I think, impossible to embrace as important for us and a source of sacrifice membership in multiple communities, familial, local, but also multinational. It is a political challenge to bring ourselves to accept those forms of membership, but it is the direction that we need to go in to deal with the issues we're talking about here.
Great. Bill. Yes.
Two comments. First of all, what we're talking about now is anything but an abstract question, especially in relationship to the first panel today. Social democracy, which I favor, rests on social solidarity, which I also favor. And so if we're in favor of various kinds of egalitarian moves in the area of economic policy, et cetera, then social solidarity is the precondition for everything we want. And we have to think very hard about the relationship between immigration policies and other policies on the one hand and social solidarity on the other. I don't have that is not to suggest a specific answer to that question, but it is to pose the question in a way that I think is correct empirically. Now, I wanted also to build on something that Astra said, because I think it was very, very important corrective. It's easy to feel that, and as we're discussing immigration, that we are swimming against a tide of reaction. In fact, that is not true. It's not even close to being true. As a matter of fact, it's not true at all. As we know from solid survey research, there is not majority support for the wall. There certainly isn't majority support or anything like it for the kinds of harsh tactics that were used to try to discourage immigration, particularly by families with young children. Nor is there any support, nor is there anything like majority support for dramatically reducing the overall levels of immigration, as many proposals made in the past 2 years would have. On the contrary, there is not only support for current or higher levels of immigration, but there is also support for not only legal status, but a path to citizenship, not just for DACA eligibles, but for everyone else who is in the country without legally authorized status or documents, what have you. So in fact, what we're being confronted with on a daily basis is nothing like what the American people as a whole say they want. And the question is, what consequences will that mismatch between claims on the one hand and realities on the other have. One final observation, and that is that the United States is nowhere near the top of the world in its share of first-generation immigrants or in its annual flows of immigrants as a share of its total population. And I think it might be useful to take a look at countries like our neighbor to the north, which have managed to sustain much higher levels of overall immigration with much less political pushback, much less of a challenge to social solidarity. I don't mean to say that the Canadian system is perfect, but I can say this, that it enjoys an astonishing level of public support, and it'd be interesting to try to think through why that is.
Alexander. Yeah.
Jim, I want to think about your statement, open borders bump into the demos. So first of all, they're not necessarily inconsistent. Remember that for the first 130 years of this country, we had democracy of some kind and open borders, except for the Chinese exclusion, big exclusion in the 1880s, and Japanese exclusion in 1907. But there was basically open borders and well, we can make different judgments about the flourishing of democracy, but nominally democracy and open borders. So there's not necessarily an inconsistency. And even if one does bump into the other, it's not obvious to me which wins as a moral or theoretical claim. I think that's what I was trying to say. And the other point is that the demos does change. However it was constructed up front, it's really startling what happened. In the 1920s, when we first did put in serious limits on immigration, it was an attempt to call back that earlier time of a white Christian United States. The 1965 change in the immigration laws, which had tremendous, mostly unanticipated consequences, but the European part of the flow went from 80% to 20% over the next continuing up to this time. The million green cards we hand out a year overwhelmingly go to immigrants of color. So there has been a very substantial shift in the demos, from the demos itself. The Supreme Court of the United States has said that states can't keep undocumented children out of public schools. So there are parts of our liberal democracy that move in other directions other than, now, obviously major issues about race and racism and the like, but it's interesting how even these exclusive demos become more expansive over time sometimes.
I have Michael, Jeffrey, and Bill Crystal, and then we'll have to break. Michael.
Yeah, I'm here. Interesting little point of historical information about the 65 Immigration Act. Completely uncontroversial at the time. Absolutely, completely uncontroversial. There were no demonstrations. There was no intensive lobbying of Congress. There was a poll done before it passed, and public opinion, a plurality of public opinion was in fact against it, but not strongly. And then there was a poll taken after it passed, and a plurality of public opinion was for it. This is back in the days when people looked at Congress and figured they knew what they were doing, and they probably knew best. No, right. And then it changed, it changed over the course of it took a long time, though. It really didn't change until the 80s. But anyway, Bill Galston stole my thunder a bit, but so I suppose I'll just back up his point by saying, I just called up on my computer here a Gallup poll from last year. 3/4 of Americans think immigration is a good thing. 65% of Republicans and Republican-leaning independents agree. 39% say immigration should be kept at present level. 28% say increased. What does that leave for decrease? 19, or something like that. I'm bad at math. Anyway, it's not that the American people are anti-immigration, and I think, to go back to what Jim said a moment ago about what identifies us as a people, if it is just the abstraction of adherence to the Bill of Rights and certain documents and tenets, apparently 3/4 of the American people are fine with that. I find that kind of reassuring. The problem, and I hope this isn't too, blunt and impolite to say at a forum like this, the problem is really not public opinion or the views of the American people. The problem is that one of our two political parties is a white ethno-nationalist party and stops sensible reform from happening. The immigration bill, whatever you think of it, its good and bad points in 2013, passed the Senate easily and would have passed the House pretty easily any day that it would have been brought to the floor, but the Speaker of the House wouldn't bring it to the floor because it was going to cost him his job if he did so.
Great. Jeffrey.
Thanks. Quickly, so this conference is on liberalism and democracy. Both of these, I would say, are essentially contested concepts. We have the concepts that we're using. And then we have the world that we're applying the concepts to. The concepts have a kind of denotative or referential function, but they also have a normative function. And this often gets mixed up when we talk. So that, for example, the demos needs to decide the demos with regard to Central American asylum seekers and refugees. Is the demos we're talking about the idealized demos of a democratic theory, like, let's say, a Deweyan or Habermasian or Amy Gutman like little seminar, where everyone's basically equal and then we're deciding how to organize our house? Or is it the actual demos of the United States, which is like an incredibly imperfect liberal democracy with many sorts of power inequalities, and also these histories that we're talking about? That demos is very far from the idealized demos, but often when we talk about policy, we imagine ourselves to be a participant in an idealized discourse. We're not. Okay, one other point which relates. So when we talk about the border, and we talk about immigration control, I think, and this is where liberalism is in tension with democracy, at least at some level of abstraction, and it's important to be a liberal, I believe. It's important for me to say this. We're talking about the border control, immigration control, involves many aspects of a police state. We don't think about what it means to say that people can't come in. But in fact, what it means is detentions of lots and lots of people, cruelties. This is part of the system. I'm not saying, by the way, that that means there should be open borders, but I'm saying as liberal Democrats reasoning about these issues, we should think about the empirical realities of cruelty, which are very significant. And you made the point about Jim Crow. You know, I was teaching Frederick Douglass last semester in my class, and he's talking about the Fugitive Slave Act. And there are things that he says that are like what the experience of actually including the woman who cleans my house, what she experiences. And that is very important ethically and politically from the vantage point of liberal democracy.
That's great. Bill, yes.
Actually, I was going to make a somewhat similar point, just put in a word maybe before we break for liberalism, which has been, I think, less prominent, maybe understandably, in this particular discussion than democracy. I always hear all this talk about the demos gets me nervous because there are a lot of reasons not to be a great fan of the demos in practice and even in theory, I would argue. And liberalism is underrated, I would say, and as a solution, as it were, to dealing with immigration and others of these problems. Bill Galston, with whom I agree on most practical issues, couldn't resist saying that he believes in social justice and social solidarity. I'm not so sure I prefer liberal justice and a little less solidarity, and how about a little more just old-fashioned respect, for people's rights and for people's, and respecting individual liberty in this sort of John Stuart Mill way. It's not quite as sophisticated, perhaps, but it would not be a bad thing to have more of in our politics. And I do think, and this is sort of an excuse made for Trump, which I don't agree with, but it's not ridiculous when people said that the Trump electorate basically looked at 40 years of identity politics and decided, well, great, we'll have white working class identity politics too. We're a demos, and everyone's kind of ignoring us, and we'll just express our demotic urges and anxieties, and he's speaking to these anxieties, and everyone else gets to elaborate on their unhappiness and anxieties, and so we're just going to indulge ours. And the best argument to that, I do not believe, is
sort of contrary appeals to different demoses, but a more old-fashioned appeal to a basic structure of constitutional norms and liberal rights and respect for individuals, not just citizens, incidentally. It's not an accident that this liberal Constitution respects persons, not just citizens, right? I mean, that's a very liberal thing in the 14th Amendment and elsewhere. Rogers knows more about this than I do, but I believe that what I said is correct. And the tradition of American and Anglo-American even law has a certain old-fashioned, simple-minded, liberal respect that certain individuals shouldn't be treated in certain ways, including if they're applying for asylum or if they're recent immigrants or whatever. So I just want to put in a word for, as we go forward, for the liberalism side of the liberalism and democracy discussion.
That's a perfect note on which to end, because when we reconvene at 2 o'clock, we're going to be discussing majoritarian conceptions of popular purity and what some people call populism. I think that's, it's the elephant in the room that I hope we'll try to get our arms around when we return. There will be questions from the audience this afternoon. We have microphones set up. I'm sorry we've run out of time this morning, but if you come back, we'll field questions as the day goes on. Thank you very much.